What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at my thoughts on a possible Morrowind remake or remaster, following a bunch of news articles very recently, primarily in response to an interview one Bruce Nesmith did with a company called Pressbox. Now, Bruce Nesmith is no longer working at Bethesda, which I think is important. He left in 2021, but was formerly the lead designer on Skyrim as an example, and had been there for a while prior to that, of course. This interview covered a lot of stuff. It was mainly about Bethesda and the Elder Scrolls Fallout, the usual stuff, but he was also there to talk a little bit about his book series that he's published since, and I wanted to provide just that bit of context here at the beginning. I should also be linking that article down below if you want to read the interview for itself, but one question in particular, or one response to a question in that interview, set off a little swarm of news articles and things like that being published from the usual gaming outlets. The reason for that being, of course, that it does touch on an interesting subject of conversation when it comes to gaming, especially following the Oblivion remaster, which of course opened the floodgates of people talking about potential remakes or remasters in the future, which brings us to Morrowind here. So in this interview, Nesmith was asked about the possibility of a Morrowind remake or remaster, and he had a few things to say. I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist of it was that A, there were concerns about whether the source code even exists anymore and what they could do with that just as a sort of baseline. He also then goes on to mention that Morrowind is very old. Many of its mechanics are quite dated by today's standards, which is simply a statement of fact, and then follows that on with pointing out the obvious, which is that you could potentially sidestep some of those issues with a full-blown remake, but mentions that at that point, why not make something new instead, which is, of course, an opinion, but something that's bound to come up in the conversation anyway. Now, all told, if you actually read through his response in the interview, it's pretty much what you would expect, and largely the things most people are in fact saying, some of which I'm about to tell you right now, because I simply think the reality of either doing a remaster or a remake for Morrowind would be difficult to pull off in a way that made everyone happy. I think you could definitely do it a number of ways, but any number of those ways will ultimately upset someone or some group of people, which is why, sort of after Oblivion Remastered dropped, I made a video talking about potential future ones. I think if any other game of theirs they would try to give the remake remaster treatment to, it would probably be Fallout 3, because I simply think that would be the easiest one to do next. But I also mentioned that I think it made a ton of sense for them to start with Oblivion, because Oblivion had a number of problems that were universally recognized as the issue, and the remaster did things to address those. The main thing people are upset with when it comes to that particular remaster these days is the performance of it. And that's, of course, before we even talk about the fact that Virtuous did a lot of it instead of Bethesda themselves. When you start talking about other games then, I think especially Morrowind, that becomes a lot more difficult, because what people don't like about Morrowind changes a lot based on who you're talking to. Personally, the thing I don't like about it is the hit chance in a 3D world with your melee swings and stuff. It just doesn't sit right with me to be in either a first-person or even third-person situation where I'm seeing the weapon connect physically in that view, but it doesn't actually do anything because it's down to the dice roll, so to speak, behind the scenes. I've never liked that with that particular camera perspective. However, there are a lot of people that do like that about Morrowind. It's also a system that's greatly tied to all of its other systems in terms of how it does its damage rolls behind the scenes. So it's not just as simple as not doing that. And given how vocal people are who love Morrowind, you've suddenly got yourself in a bit of a situation, because whenever you do something like make a game, you have to ask yourself who the audience for that game is. And in the case of Morrowind, you could theoretically say that it's the people who have played and love Morrowind, but also people who are looking to get into it and experience what that game was for themselves in some capacity. And I just don't think there's a way to approach a remake or a remaster for that game in a way that is going to please all of those people. If anything, I think what it would actually do is wind up being a giant headache for Bethesda, where people use it as another excuse to complain about what they do in essentially every forum imaginable. So looking at this a little more pragmatically, let's separate this out. I'll be blunt, I think if I am Bethesda in any capacity, I probably just don't touch this at all. I think, yes, there's probably a perfect world where you thread this needle exactly and everybody loves it, sure. But being the realist that I prefer to be, I think there's a much greater chance doing anything with Morrowind blows it up in your face and it just becomes a huge hassle. Now, they very well may have different thinking on that, but given how resistant they've seemed even to the idea, it seems like a reasonable enough assumption, but, again, who knows what they're actually going to do. From my standpoint, I just don't see a world in which I would ever touch that if I was the person making that decision. There's a lot to lose, and it comes at the expense of resources that could be spent elsewhere, like with The Elder Scrolls 6 as an example. But let's then flip that, because I don't work at Bethesda. I'm in fact just a random guy on the internet who talks about video games too much. And so from my perspective, yeah, sure, I would be down for a Morrowind remake or remaster. It's either good or it's bad, and I'm going to have fun making videos about it either way. So in that very selfish sense, would I love them to do it? Sure, of course. But let's break even that down a little bit farther and kind of go from there. So straight away, I think a remaster would be out of the question. I do not see a world in which they drop a remaster for Morrowind. The reason for that is actually very simple: the mods. There is nothing I think you could do with a remaster of Morrowind that mods and things like the engine replacement that is OpenMW haven't already done for themselves. I also think a remaster wouldn't make the people who wanted to play Morrowind to experience it for the first time in the modern era happy either, frankly. Those people probably wouldn't enjoy a remaster because it would likely carry over the things that they don't like about the current version of Morrowind, because replacing them requires a lot more than a remaster. And again, if you want to include mods, you could probably just make that experience for yourself right now anyway, provided you've got the patience to set it all up. So if they touch this game, which again I don't really think they would do to begin with, I think it would have to be a remake. But then a remake also gets into a few issues. How much can you change with Morrowind and still have it be Morrowind? There's the look of the game, for starters, just straight away. Morrowind, a very distinct older art style, let's call it, that has certainly evolved since then. And while I definitely think they could do Morrowind in the modern day, I mean, look at The Elder Scrolls Online. They've done a version of the Morrowind province pretty easily, and I think it looks pretty good for what it is, but that art style also still isn't what Morrowind is typically associated with, as it tends to be a little more, MMO-ish, I guess, for the lack of a better word, and I don't think that specific art style would cut it for Morrowind either, but I do think it's possible to make Morrowind look good in today's era. However, like anything, change is never universally liked, and so people would be upset about whatever they actually landed on. But then there's the rest of it. So the combat system that I've already mentioned, I would be willing to bet that would be one of the first things on the chopping block, but let's assume there's a magical world where just that small change wouldn't upset an entire section of older players who really love that system for what it is, because that's Morrowind to them. Sort of problem there is that that system is tied to so many of Morrowind's other systems that you would then also have to change as a sort of cascade effect. A significant amount of how Morrowind works, especially on combat level, comes down to the fact that when you take those swings, it's a dice roll based on all your skills and everything. So you've got to change that out entirely, and yes, obviously they could use the model of the later games as a sort of base starting point, like Oblivion, obviously, or Skyrim, naturally. And while it's certainly not an impossible thing to do, and I'm not trying to imply that it is, it's simply a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of mini micro decisions along the way that you're going to have to make in association with that as well. Which brings me to another point. Something that's easy enough to forget about the Oblivion remaster is that it is fundamentally using the same stuff as the regular version of Oblivion, because that game is a sort of Frankenstein of Unreal Engine onto the original game's engine, which is how they get the updated graphics and stuff while still retaining all the logic and sort of oddities that are Oblivion. With a full-blown remake, you would almost certainly lose a lot of that stuff, and I think it's possible a lot of it would feel exponentially different than what Morrowind is right now, which would almost certainly, again, upset the people who love Morrowind for what it is. But those are big, complicated questions to some degree. Let's talk about simpler stuff. Most of Morrowind just straight up is not voiced. If you remake it, are you going to add voice acting to that? How many people are going to be upset that the voice they had in their head of a certain character is no longer what that character is because of the voice that you've just added? sounds real simple, but I review games a lot and people get real weird about voice acting in games. And you could pretty simply continue to go down and down the list of Morrowind's features and things and have to address every single one of those. So, while I could sit here and continue to make examples, I think I've kind of made my point at this juncture, so simply put, I don't think a remaster would cut it. It just wouldn't make any sense with everything that's already available for Morrowind via its mods and stuff, and I think a remake would force you to make so many decisions about what that game is actually going to be that it's more than likely just going to upset a lot of people more than it is going to be successful. I think it's possible for them to do a Morrowind in a way that, again, makes everybody happy, but I mean, the chances of that working out I think are pretty low, and that's just assuming we're talking about infinite possibilities here, because reality is, with Bethesda currently primarily focused on The Elder Scrolls 6, I sincerely doubt they're going to do much of a project like that on their own, which is why they had people like Virtuous doing Oblivion. And given all the game industry layoffs lately, I sincerely doubt they're going to hire and onboard their own team either. So, long story short, I guess, a Morrowind remake or remaster, to me, that's just a no-win situation for them. I would love to see it personally. I would play it regardless. I think no matter what actually happened with it, it would make for an interesting conversation, but I think too many groups of people would want a game like that to be too many different things, and would likely result in simply just a giant mess. Hence why I think the best course of action, for them at least, would probably be to just leave it alone, which is where I'm going to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed hearing me ramble about all of that. Now, I am almost certain that a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions about this one, so by all means let me know about them down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. I'd love to hear about what your perfect version of a remastered or remade of Morrowind actually is, which I am specifically asking for because I would be willing to bet we get a lot of conflicting comments about exactly that. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.